Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our seminar today. And we have a very exciting talk in store by Professor William Ellis. And the title of today's talk is The Intimate Vegetal Ontology of Rastafarians in the Western Cape, Plant Intimacy and Critique as Becoming Plant. And just to give you a brief biography of Prof Ellis. Prof Ellis is a lecturer in anthropology at the University of the Western Cape. He teaches courses in Economic Anthropology, Anthropological Theory, and the Anthropology of Africa, focusing on the links between religion and economy. Additionally, his work explores the well-known debates in social sciences, such as the dialectic of the master and the slave, Marx's labor theory of value, among a few. And it also includes the ontological turn and the ethnography of the more than human. He maintains strong interests in Khoisan studies, indigeneity, and is passionate about researching the human-plant interface. He has done extensive fieldwork among the San people in the Southern Kalahari. The main thrust of his fieldwork there was on land reform, natural resources management, and the intersections with culture. He has also worked on several projects in the Northern Cape that aim to examine knowledge, connections, and plant ontologies. He is also keenly interested in the Afrofuturist movement and science fiction in Africa. And with some of you who might have done the course with me in the first semester, you might remember also going through Prof Ellis's paper when we briefly looked at multi-species and walking ethnographies. So that's the kind of focus that our talk might touch on today. So without any further ado, I hand over to you, Prof Ellis.
Thank you, Lucy, for that. With that introduction, I feel a great responsibility to live up to all those things. I must add that some of those things, especially the courses I've been teaching in economic anthropology, which dealt with things like master and slave theories of value and that, I've left them behind, and I now teach new courses in environmental anthropology. So it's a growing field. It's a field that we're still exploring. It's quite exciting, and it's something that it's a trend that's happening globally. A lot of anthropology departments across the globe are shifting to teaching environmental anthropology, especially at this moment with the environmental crisis, the question of the Anthropocene and so on. How I would characterize my work these days is mainly within two fields. I don't know where you got the biography, but I must take it down because some of those things I've kind of left behind, and you know, I've developed new focus at the moment. But I've taken to talking about myself as an ethnographer of plants. I'm really interested in what people have to say about plants, what they do with plants, the relationships they form with plants, the stories they tell about plants, and what kind of beings they think plants are. So broadly, my interest is then also in, or asks the question rather, can we do an ethnography of plants? What would that look like? And you know, I play with it as an experimental form where we have, instead of the human, or the orthodox or the classic or the traditional human subject as or human as the subject of the ethnography or the human group, what if we made a plant, or for those interested in multi-species questions, what if we made an animal or an object or substance? What if we made that the central subject or the central figure in our ethnographies? What kind of ethnographies would we produce? And of course, because it's ethnography, I mean, I'm not suggesting that we write solely about plants, but because it's ethnography, we cannot escape that kind of ethnos part of it. Because it's anthropology, we cannot escape the anthropos. We cannot escape bringing humans back into the story. because no matter how hard we try to make an animal or plant the subject of an ethnography, it's ultimately a work done from a human frame. So we're constantly returning to that. And again, as I said, it's an experimental mode to try and see how much of the other we can include in the ethnography, even if it's simply from a human frame. That's kind of what I wanted to say in terms of, or just to add to link up with Malusi and the way he introduced me. So what am I going to be talking about today? And colleagues must excuse me. I'm basically just going to be reading. It's a very, very, very provisional work. It's part of a larger project that sees me revisiting something or some work that I did in the mid to late 1990s. Now, up until now, or up until earlier this year, I've largely been unable to write about a lot of that ethnographic fieldwork that I did, mostly because it was an extremely painful experience. And one I wanted to leave behind. I didn't want to return to the subject matter that I was dealing with at that time. I didn't want to think about what had happened, how the field work had gone. I didn't want to think about the people that were involved in those moments. And I generally didn't want to deal with the pain of the field work. I've now, I don't know what changed. I don't know how this came about. It just started happening. But I've now started writing about that process and about that field work. And it's actually been a very, as you may well think, or may well realize, it was an extremely cathartic process, and it continues to be that. But so what is the larger project here that I'm alluding to? Well, the larger project, again, it sits within this notion of the ethnography of plants. And what I'm really interested in the presentation that I'm going to give today, and in the larger project that this is a part of, is this question of becoming plant. People, I'm more and more, I'm looking at people, and I'm looking at groups, human groups, to use something that's maybe not popular to say, I'm looking at cultures and how they are becoming plant, or how they form very intimate, very crucial, critical relationships with plants. And I'm interested in the process of how that happens. And my suspicion is that there are groups out there. In fact, more, not just groups out there. My suspicion is more and more that plants hold a very central role in daily life. And the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is that even though plants hold such a central role in our daily lives, we're largely actually ignorant of this. And it's only once we start talking, or it's only once somebody starts listening to the things that we say, that we can distill and hear how close plants really are to us. So wherever I go, I constantly listen for talk about the plants, talk about the trees, about the medicinal plants, about the food plants, and so on and so forth. Now, this research that I did in the 1990s was basically research with Rastafarian bush doctors. These are Rastafarians who sell herbs, who prescribe herbal remedies. They usually have stalls, and people come to them to purchase herbs. They collect herbs in various locations, in the mountains, in the dune systems around the Western Cape, in gardens. They have people who they have their relationships with, and they ask them for plants from their gardens, so on and so forth. So one other disclaimer before I begin the presentation is that when I speak about Rastafarians, I'm really speaking about Rastafarians, or people who call themselves Rastafarians, at a particular moment in the 1990s, particularly in the Western Cape. And we can narrow it down even more, that the vast majority of the Rastafarians that I work with were actually colored, or would also see themselves as colored. And this is significant, because what's happened in the last 3 decades is that the Rastafarian movement in the Western Cape and in South Africa and globally for that matter has not radically, but has changed. It's not a static movement. And one of the things that's happened is that there are these various different expressions or types or particular expressions of Rastafarianism or Rastafarianhood for that matter. And they may not necessarily be the same ideologically, formally, and so on, as what I'm talking about, referring to from my case study, which is located in the 1990s. So just as a note, I'm aware that Rastafarian, or what people who will consider themselves Rastafarians today and maybe practicing this religion, this culture, may not recognize some of the things that I talk about. But that's largely because it's not a static situation, and it's actually adapted and grown and changed a lot over the last 2-3 decades. So let me just start. And as I said, I'm just going to read. So the title of my presentation is The Intimate Vegetal Ontology of Rastafarians in the Western Cape. And it's about, or it's subtitled Plant Intimacy and Critique as Becoming Plant. Now, I started saying by talking about how painful the fieldwork experience was during the 90s. And I start my presentation, or let me start this by just quoting something from a poem by Thabo Mbeki, the poem I Am an African. There's a line in the poem that's always stuck with me because it resonated with me because I could relate to it. I could see the people that he was talking about. And it's suffice to say, it's completely out of context. So let's understand it just for that. And the quote goes, or the part of the poem that I want to highlight goes, those who have lost or who have to lose their sanity, because to be insane or to be sane is to invite pain. And this quote reminds me a lot of the Rastafarian that I was working with in the 90s, because this is exactly what happened to him. He struggled with mental health, with spiritual health. He struggled with his quote unquote sanity. And so this paper is based on the fieldwork I conducted from about 94 to 98. And it was when I was a postgrad student. And the person that I'm speaking with is somebody that I was apprenticed to. In other words, I was training under him to understand, and I was learning about the plants. And he saw himself as what he calls a bush doctor. And he went by the name Naftali, one of the tribal appellations that Rastafarians used to designate themselves individually. But he also went by the name Saki, which is short for Isak. And I use his real name because he was always clear about this. He wants to be known as the keeper of this knowledge. So he wants his personhood, his individuality to be recognized by the use of his own name. So I've not written about this episode extensively because it actually ends in tragedy, and a tragedy that left me highly disillusioned and disenchanted with the subject matter, basically with the questions of Rastafarianism, with plants, healing plants, ethnomedicine, and generally, I became extremely disenchanted, and I took a decision to distance myself from this kind of research. Saki, in his turn, he had a serious psychotic break, and he got lost in the world of sorcery and magic. And he would never return from this journey, and he eventually passes away in 2012. Suffice to say, I was dragged along this path with him. It was painful to see him fade into a world that that had little bearing with this one. But that as it is. So I want to move on by introducing this notion of the bush doctor. So when someone like Saki calls himself, or when another Rastafarian calls himself a bush doctor, what are they referring to? What do they say? What are they meaning, right? Who do they designate or give that title to? So bush doctor is a kind of an autonym, a self-ascribed title that many Rastafarians use to describe themselves when they have trained in the arts of using healing herbs, roots, vegetal substances, and on occasion mineral compounds. The concept to them has no derogatory meanings, right? And is in fact a celebrated title and a revered category. So the person of the bush doctor is someone who's seen or held in very high regard in the community. One could, however, from an academic point of view, raise a critical matter of the degrading potential of the term. And in the same way as there have been critiques of the term witch doctor. So some academics, or the question would be, do we equate the term bush doctor and witch doctor? And do we apply the same kind of critique of, a kind of critique of, or let's call it a cultural relativist or ethnocentric critique of the ethnocentrism in terms of how these concepts, bush doctor and witch doctor, are concerned? The first thing to say then, of course, is that, possibly, yes, there is a critique to be had here. So why do we call somebody a bush doctor? Is that not a term that somehow deflates their practice? Because bush could refer to the jungle, the wilds, the veldt. It could refer to something that's not as pure a healing substance, it's not as pure as the pharmaceuticals are considered to be, and so on and so on. The commentary goes, and I think we see more or less where that critique moves towards. Now, part of the critique of the term bush doctor is linked to the critique of the word witch doctor. And this critique assumes a kind of a consonant meaning for the two terms. Rastas, however, use these two designations in very different ways. So bush doctor and witch doctor to them are very separate terms. Bush doctor has a particular methodology, and there are certain rules of practice that distinguish it from a witch doctor, purposely. And the first has to do with the nature of the medicinal substances that the two types of healers use. In fact, bush doctors cultivate a kind of a purity of practice based on the avoidance of certain substances, specifically animal substances. Now, these animal products, they say, are used by witch doctors. And these witch doctors, not as generally defined in Western understanding, but witch doctors here specifically as understood by Rastas, they see these animal products used by witch doctors as polluting, because to consume the flesh of an animal or to consume these animal products is to participate, for Rastafarians, is to participate in the consumption of death, and as per the prohibition on the consumption of carrion from the Old Testament, right? So they really see this as eating death, or eating a dead thing. So in the first instance then, bush doctors would avoid animal products, and they only use plants in their cures and healing substances. The second distinction that Rastafarians make between, or the Rastafarians I encounter make between bush doctor and witch doctor, has to do with the reference to what, let's broadly call it, magic and sorcery. So witch doctor for Rastafarians is not distinct from witch. And this is important to note, because in kind of the classical studies of traditional healing in Southern Africa, other parts of the world, but specifically in Southern Africa, it's always very important for the anthropologists or the scientists to make this distinction between what they call a gricha or witch and a gricha on the other side, which is often translated as a kind of witch doctor, right? The person who heals witchcraft. But to Rastafarians, witch doctor or the notion of witch doctors, there's nothing distinct for them. The witch and the witch doctor are the same thing, and the practices to Rastafarians are seen as being the same thing. Now, witch doctors, broadly, and this is very simplistic, but it's been toned down for the presentation. But so we can say that witch doctors treat people who've been bewitched, and these witch doctors may themselves attack people using plants and animal substances. At least this is what some Rastafarians who I spoke to suggest. So while they are never supposed to bewitch people, witch doctors will offer charms and talismans, as well as protective herbs, to help those who may be embroiled in witchcraft attacks. Theirs, the bush doctors, is a protective magic, and one that fights magic rather than engage in producing magic. I want to just, in kind of closing, just have do a little consideration of the origin of the term bush doctor. Now, I'm given to believe that the term has a kind of Caribbean origin, right? Because this is where Rastafarianism is seen as originating. Some Rastafarians, in fact, refer to a song by Peter Tosh, the song called Bush Doctor, as the origin of their conception of this identity of the Bush Doctor. The song Bush Doctor, just so by the way, is the song about the legalization of marijuana. And at one point, Peter Tosh is naming all these healing qualities of cannabis. He's saying it's good for this, it's good for that. He says, well, look, actually don't ask me. I'm not a Bush doctor, right? To signify that the Bush doctor would know better about healing plants and so on. Now, it is further suggested that this term, Bush doctor, also has origins in the African-American community descended from slaves who may have developed a key knowledge of the medicinal and useful plants in places like the Caribbean. So the suggestion is that Bush doctor is not a novel term as such. It is actually a term that has a history. It comes from somewhere. So in a similar way, the Cape Town quote unquote colored Bush doctor sees his history as being seated in an earlier African form, such as the African-American origin of Bush doctor. And in the case of many of these Rastas, it is the Khoisan form, especially those in the Western Cape. It's the Khoisan as the earlier African form or the earlier ancestral form of their current identity as Bush doctors. Saki himself initially saw himself as exactly such a Bush doctor. And he refers to its origins in reggae, its origins in Africa, and he specifically refers to his knowledge of healing plants as being seated within, was being part of a heritage of Khoi medicines, specifically from the Western Cape. I think we can just quickly ask another question. So how do these Bush doctors actually learn about healing plants? And I think it's significant. It's interesting to note the different parts of learning. So the first path to learning about healing plants is through the collection of plants. So a person wanting to become a Bush doctor would be told to collect certain plants. You would be shown which plants to collect. And this process of collecting plants and bringing them to a more experienced Bush doctor who will sell them or then make remedies, this is largely a process of learning about particular species, but also learning about sites and environments in which particular plants can be collected. The next method is actually the actual observation of sale of herbs and the learning of what are called combinations. When people come to purchase herbs, the apprentice, the one who usually collects, sees what is being prescribed for what, and they learn from that. They also see what combination of plants, because most times, for particular illnesses, the Bush doctor won't give a single plant. He'll give a combination of plants. So he'll give different plants to affect the healing. And the apprentice has to learn what these combinations are, say a combination for diabetes or a combination for high blood pressure. He has to know which plants he's able to combine in order to prescribe or to heal or treat that. So the Bush doctor would prescribe herbs in various combinations or singularly for the ailments that people brought to him. And the apprentice is meant to learn while watching. Sometimes a person would present themselves and ask for a specific herb for a specific ailment that they're suffering from. And this use by clients is then incorporated by the Bush doctor into his practice. So they don't only just learn from each other, they also learn from older or from other people who come and say, I need this herb for this purpose. That particular treatment is then built into the Bush doctor's knowledge. The process of acquiring knowledge is also a dialogic process, and Bush doctors learn from the interactions with each other as much as these people or these other peoples that come sometimes also learn from them. So there's a two-way movement of herbal or plant knowledge here. In the same way, these herbalists pick up knowledge from each other. So when herbalists encounter each other, when they collect plants together, or when they sit together, work, they gather knowledge from each other. There's also a process that Rastafarians engage in, especially when they go out into nature to collect plants. That's a process of walking and learning. And this walking and learning is very important, especially in relation to plants. It's what I choose to call a kind of peripatetic approach to the learning about and doing with plants. So this walking school that they have, the way you learn is walk in nature, encounter the plants, talk to someone, older person, a senior Rasta will inform you what the use is. But it's important that you take this walking trip in order to learn. Some Rastafarians have also taken under their wing several other younger bush doctors, and they on occasion would come together and they would review the kind of combinations, the particular herbs described for particular illnesses. So there's a kind of refresher. Lastly, one of the last things I want to mention here is that there's sometimes, or some of the Rastas I spoke to would mention significant persons who are not Rastafarians, but who have taught them about plants. In some towns in the Northern Cape, for instance, I remember one Rastafarian said, you know, he didn't learn from other Rastafarians. He actually learned from this older gentleman in town who's not a Rastafarian, but who had been a herbalist, right? He'd been practicing herbalism for many decades, and he actually learned from him, right? Often in this regard, many Rastas will also mention older relatives as people who they've learned from. Now, I want to move on from that category, bush doctor, into the actual kind of meat of the discussion, so to say, the kind of theoretical moves I'm trying to develop in this work on vegetal ontologies. The first point I want to make in regard to Rastafarianism is that Rastafarianism uses plants as a kind of cultural critique. And here I want to argue that Rastafarians cultivate a kind of plant intimacy, and it's based in an ideology of cultural critique, and that is further a part of a larger process of actually becoming plant almost, or becoming with plants. And the plant becomes the central focus of the Rastafarian life, or the lives of Rastafarians, as both food, as sacrament, and medicine. But why? Why plants? Well, the reasons that some Rastafarians give, or the arguments that they themselves make, is that we can suggest that this centrality of plants is part of a kind of a critique of the Babylon and its culture. Now, Babylon is a particular concept that Rastafarians use to categorize the modern industrial capitalist urban system, or a system of life that they contrast to their own way of living, an ital or a kind of an asceticism that they practice. And I'll say more about this in a second. So plants are this vital point or item that they can critique the Babylon culture through. So Rastafarians separate themselves from Babylon, and they do this via critique of things like foodways, consciousness, and healing. Right? And this healing is specifically about healing the person who's become a Rastafarian from the lifestyle of the Babylon. And at the center of this critique of foodways, consciousness, is plants, right? So the foodways, it's about Rastafarians being vegetarians or vegan. They say, no, we can't eat like the Babylon. We can't eat all this meat and chemicals and processed substances. We eat only plants, right? The consciousness through the sacrament of marijuana, of cannabis or ganja, whatever you want to call it, we have an altered consciousness different from that of the Babylon. And then lastly, the effects of Babylon, the ailments that it's caused in your life, the negative impacts it's had on you, we cure this through this process of adapting our food ways, adapting what we eat, adapting our consciousness, right? And also through the use of medicinal plants or tonic plants, you know, specific kinds of plants like mpepo or buchu for that matter. Now, the critique is partly a kind of asceticism. And this asceticism mainly prohibits the consumption of meat and confines the diet of the Rastafarian to the vegetal. Meat, as I said earlier, is seen as carrion and corpses, and that to consume it would be tantamount to eating death. One thus abstains from the consumption of meat. This abstention is seen as clearing the body of any pollutants or negative effects or deathly spirit or spirits of death that may have accumulated and it does so by infusing the self through the plants, the energy, with a kind of vital energy or life force that is contained only in plants. So the plants largely is seen as having some kind of vitalism. And this vitalism, or this thinking about vitalism, or this vitalism of the Rastafarian, sees plants as providing essences of what some call ital, which is a notion of vegetal and spiritual purity, specifically in what you consume in terms of food and medicines for that matter. Now, throughout their life, the Rasta consumes only ital essences, and this is in order to cultivate the spirit that continues to protect it from the ravages of Babylon. So in a way, the Rasta is becoming like the plant, which is seen as containing this vital energy that can be transferred to the body of the practitioner of this particular religion or culture. So we see in this kind of idea, this vitalism of plants, this thing that plants possess that meat doesn't, that Babylon doesn't. In your consumption or your engagement with this ital, your spirit and the spirit of the plant, or the spirit of the ital, they're converging, they're becoming one, right? And so on. Let me say a little bit more about that. So what we're really looking at here, in my sense, is what I would call an ontological closeness of the two worlds, the world of the Rastafarian and the world of the plants. So we can say that the ontological closeness of plants, it fosters a kind of intimacy based on, among other things, a politics of the body, cultural political criticism, and practice of care that serves as the basis for everyday life for the Rastafarian. Now, this intimacy is both about bringing these forces into the body, the ital, the vitalism that's assumed in their philosophy, but it also, at the same time, it fosters certain affinities with plants. And in the larger work, I try and show how some Rastas even form intimate relationships with particular plants, and not a romantic kind of intimacy, but a corporal, cultural intimacy, right? So I see a lot of people a lot of Rastas that really love buchu, or they really love a tea made out of mpepo, right? And this becomes such an integral part of their life that they daily consume it in order to produce certain states, to produce states of purity, states of ital, and so forth and so on. So the boundaries that plants created between, say, purity and pollution, danger and refuge, are the main elements of the kind of cultural critique of Babylon. Hence, this engagement with plants is not just about a kind of a veganism and that separates us and them. It is actually a way of critiquing the Babylon. So largely the Rasta culture fosters practices of care, right? Located in the asceticism, that is vegetarianism, and the healing with herbs that are meant to draw the person out of Babylon, and also, and which also is meant to remove the Babylon from their bodies. All this, as I've said before, makes for a convergence of the ontology of the human and the plant worlds. The aim being to bring the two worlds closer together and merge the essences of the two. What more can we say about the kind of Rastafarian philosophy of plants? So for me, the foundation of this philosophy of plants is ganja and vegetarianism. Both of these are obligatory aspects of Rastafarian life that initiate novices, newly converted or neophytes, neophytic Rastafarians, that initiate in them a continual and deep-seated commitment to plants and plant knowledges. From the moment they convert to Rastafarianism, individuals take on a constant and deliberate devotion that is evidenced by their use and consumption of exclusively plants and the like. So over time, and because of this intimate engagement, this deep-seated commitment, over time, Rastas build up a great deal of knowledge about plants, especially medicinal plants. Others still have, for instance, explored the world of wildflowers. I know, for instance, Rastafarians who sell cut flowers. All in all, these Rastafarians know a great deal about both local and introduced plant species and materials. There was, and part of this philosophy is also what I call the plant practices. So I found that the plant practices related to medicine and healing, environmental consciousness, a kind of asceticism, devotion to particular species, aesthetic practice, and the peripatetic pathetic approach to learning about and doing with plants. What am I saying? Well, plants medicines, as already said, are thought of as the best cure because they come directly from nature and are thus pure. Other aspects that are common among Rastas is the devotion or commitment to particular species. For instance, two species that I often find Rastas actively engaging with, not just in the intimate, but in a kind of a frequent way, is the herb rosemary and buchu. So in my research, a while ago, of course, rosemary was very important because it's useful. It's used for hair. It's used to combat dandruff and whatever vermin may, and clean hair in general. And also, it has a beautiful smell, so it adds that smell to the hair. Buchu in the Western Cape is another very popular herb, not just popular with Rastafarians, but popular amongst the rest of the populace as well. Very, very well known across different cultural, racial groupings in the Western Cape. And Rastas, in my experience, time I spent with Rastas, buchu becomes this very, very kind of central plant, and it's used frequently and lovingly by Rastafarians. Now, the next aspect I want to turn to is this walking or learning by walking approach to plant practices. So where do we start with that? Well, basically the walking that I'm referring to is the kind of walks that Rastafarians take in nature in order to collect plants, and the walks they take in, they do into the mountains in order to collect plants as well. So the Rastafarians at the Cape, for me, seek this kind of walking and learning, or seek this vegetal ontology within an engagement and an intimacy with nature. And this nature is especially the sites like mountains and the sea. And these sites, nature, mountains, sea, these are contrasted to the polluted state and chemicals of Babylon. For Rastas, the most sacred of spaces are the mountains and the seas. These spaces are seen as pure and not touched by the polluting effect and substances of Babylon. Babylon is the space of cities, buildings, factories, and roads with motor vehicles and other polluting instruments. Further, the main polluting substances emanating from these Babylonian spaces is often named by the term chemicals, right? So everything that is of Babylon, every substance is known as a chemical. And chemicals, in their view, or in their critique that they develop, are anathema to the cleansing effects of plants and healing. Nature, in its turn, is contrasted with, as I said before, with the ill effects of the city and Babylon in general. And it is in nature that the cleansing and healing are found, mostly in the form of plants, but also in the spirituality of the place. So it is not only the contents of nature, but the general well-being one experiences when one is wandering in nature that has a healing effect. For this reason, many Rastas periodically retreat into the mountains and into nature to literally absorb the energies found there and to rid themselves of the Babylon. Now, this should all have a very familiar ring to it, because in our culture, in Western kind of industrial society, the same kind of ideology, cultural critique and philosophy, and in fact, romanticism of things like nature and the mountains exists. And I'm going to close soon. So just one last story, and it links to the mountains. And this is a story that one of my PhD students uses in some of the work that she's produced. So I just want to note that this is not, I'm citing this from her thesis, and it's called The Man Who Inherited the Mountain. And the story goes that this guy, this one Rastafarian, Ayman Denver, he says that his mother was a flower seller in Cape Town, and that she took him to the mountains frequently with her in order to pick flowers. As life would have it, she died when he was very young. And being poor, she did not leave him much, he says. But Ayman Denver says, she did leave me a mountain. He continues to spend time in the mountains and to collect herbs there for himself and to sell. The mountains hold a special place, however, not merely because it's pretty and good to be in, but rather due to its particular ontology. So this man inherited a mountain, but he doesn't inherit the physical space. He inherits something else. He inherits, some aspect of the being of the mountain, some of these things that the mountain contains, and some of these aspects of the mountain. So the mountain for the Rasta is far away from the Babylon. It is removed from the effects of the city. It thus holds a purity that is not found in these other spaces. At the same time, it's not frequented by many people. This, some say, is because because these people are so attached to Babylon that these spaces aren't pleasant to them, and they won't make the effort to access it. The mountain is also like a type of a filter that protects its substances from the polluting effects outside of it. For instance, a lot of Rastafarians show a preference for what they call bergwater, or mountain water. This is mountain, literally water collected in the mountain from streams, from rivers, from little collection points and so on. And they have this preference because they believe this mountain water is pure and it's not been treated by chemicals. And in fact, it's almost as if the mountain has filtered out or prevented them, those chemicals from affecting the water in the first place. I think I'm almost at 45 minutes. How would I conclude? Let me just skip through some of these slides quickly. All right. I'm just going to conclude in a general sense. And let me end by saying this. So generally, the work that I'm trying to do is about discovering or asking whether or not there's a deeper vegetal ontology, an intimate one, if you will, that exists amongst Rastafarians. And it wants to argue that theirs is a plant-based culture, and it sits within a larger ideology, cultural critique and so on, as I've mentioned earlier, and it actually makes Rastafarianism a type of phytoculture, a culture that is so embroiled and indicated by plants, for that matter. And overall, in the techniques of care and the performances of these intimacies with plants, and ultimately the consumption of plants, the Rastas are exhibiting what we call an involutionary engagement. Now, involutionary engagement is not like your classic evolution, survival of the fittest. Involutionary movement would suggest that it's a co-evolution, that as the plant changes, the culture changes. As I change, the plant changes. And that in our relationship together, these coexisting relationships, we are growing and evolving together. So in that sense, because unfortunately I couldn't show all the moves that one makes in order to argue this, but because I suggest and try and show that Rastafarianism is a kind of, or Rastafarianism and plants are involved in this kind of evolutionary engagement, the conclusion is that this engagement is made possible through the becoming with plants, and maybe possibly even because it's about the shared essences, it's about also maybe becoming a plant itself. I'm going to leave it there, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for listening, guys.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation. It was quite interesting to hear you argue through that and tell us about the work you did. You said in 94, 98, but I think some of the things that you mentioned and you touched on are still quite relevant, and I'm quite interested to read the final paper. But my initial reaction perhaps would be to go back to what you mentioned initially about, the research having left you feeling disenchanted. I'd be interested to hear more about that experience and what about that, what about that the process left you disenchanted and the trauma of that fieldwork. It also reminded me of Ruth Behar's work on the vulnerable observer, and I don't know if there's any relation there, but that's what it brought about in my mind as you were speaking initially. Yeah, so I'd like to hear that from you, and maybe just to say to everyone else, please feel free to put your chats or questions in the chat box, or just raise your hand if you have a question. Thank you.
Okay, I prefer if we take one or two more questions, and then I could respond to 2 or 3 of them at a time.
Okay, okay. Are there any other questions, comments?
Gabriel's got his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Gabriel?
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks so much, Prof, for this really touching and moving piece that you've shared with us. Mine is really not a question, but just acknowledging how much, so I teach the medical anthropology module here at Rhodes. And, you know, I was just excited that a lot of our students are here. Unfortunately, a few of them are not able to join because they're in the field. But just listening to you, I could hear some of their voices in some of the class discussions we're having. And one of them, for instance, said, you know, she's undergoing training to become a traditional healer. And you know, she made mention of how her Gobela said to her, you know, you should take some weed and it will help you in this way and that way. And the whole class laughed. But, you know, just hearing of that as well today, and how it's about also dieting, that also brings health and healing in a certain way, and how you've brought that strongly as to the connection or the intimacy between the human person and the plant. You know, people say you are what you think, or you are what you eat. So the medicinal nature of the weed, and it being bringing healing to a person in aspects of their life that they might not even be aware that they need healing for. You know, it's one of the things that I really picked up, and I'm really excited about this. So really, I look forward to reading more of what will come out of this research. Thank you so much for being able to share this with us, Prof.
Thanks, Gabriel. Thanks.
Any other question?
I think Professor de Wet has his hand up.
Okay, you may go ahead, Professor de Wet.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating and important paper. I just want to say to me, you seem to raise some critical wider issues that are very, very important about a fundamental challenge to anthropology. You know, in the beginning, anthropology struggled to move away from ethnocentrism and Westo obsession. And then it tried to move away from closed systems. You know, anthropology with postmodernism and so on, anthropology has gone through various struggles to keep widening itself. Mm-hmm. And what you've done is you seem to me to have put your finger on a very important hang-up that anthropology has, speciocentrism, that we're so obsessed with human beings. And what you're doing is you're showing how certain cultures manage to move away from speciocentrism in their ontology and to say, you know, we are not the center of things, that there are ontologies, and even, to use swear words, epistemologies and ethics that are wider than us. You know, and I think in that sense, your work raises very important challenges to how we as a discipline called anthropology think about ourselves and need to extend our very ways of thinking. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thanks for the compliment. Okay, should I respond to those 3 points and then we can take another round?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so what left me disenchanted? Well, you know, I've been disenchanted let's start like this. So the classic kind of situation or the classic scenario in anthropology is that you have a person who in their early career has done kind of research in a particular field, has specialized in a particular, call it maybe medical anthropology, ethnomedicine, or your masculinities, whatever it may be. And the idea is that you follow that trajectory right throughout your life or your career as an anthropologist, and so on. Now, for me, that wasn't going to be, or I didn't, well, in a way it was, but in a way I thought it wouldn't be, especially after my experiences. I mean, it's really difficult watching somebody that you were close to. And these are not cautious terms, and sorry if I trigger anyone, but descend into madness, right? This man that I've been working with, that had been a teacher to me, and so on, that I taken guidance from, he was losing it. He was losing his touch with reality, and I had to sit and watch it. And, I had to get dragged in along. I had to watch his family break up. I had to watch him lose his children. I had to watch while people ostracized him, branded him with whatever labels, gets branded to people, or gets, I can't find the word, whichever labels get put to people who suffer from mental illness. I had to watch all of this, and I took a decision that I would start doing research in other fields. I would leave the ethnomedicine, I would leave the plants behind, I would leave the questions of healing medicine, even the issue of traditional healing that I had a great interest in. I would leave all of that behind. And then I pursued, for my master's, I did a master's thesis on tuberculosis, which for me took me very far away from the plants. However, the plants snuck up on me again. And in retrospect, and part of the larger work that I'm producing on this, and I talk about it there, so one of the things that happens when I start doing my PhD research, without asking for it, without looking for it, I start getting all this data on plants. People start showing me trees, they explain how the grass works, they explain what they use this for, what that plant is for. And here I am trying to get away from the plants, and here people are throwing the plants back at me. And so eventually I gave up, and I just acquiesced and started doing work on plants again. And there was a bit of a re-enchantment, but there is a lingering sense in which I refuse to do work with medicinal plants. To me, medicinal plants have become less interesting. The entire field of medicinal study of medicinal plants, I think, has been on both sides, the side of the researchers and the side of the researched, has really become stale. They've taken up certain issues that I think may be non-issues, especially issues around intellectual property and the like. The question of indigenous knowledge. I mean, I try my best to avoid that term, right? So the debates and the things around medicinal plants, I avoid those. And I now move, and that's why I'm trying to study plants in a different way. I'm not interested in the uses of plants or in secret knowledge or in what is good for what, providing a chemist with a list of uses for a particular plant and so on. I'm not really interested in that. I'm more interested in the stories, in the way it constructs culture, right? So yeah, we do get disenchanted sometimes, and I think it's okay to be tired of the kind of research that you thought would take you would be able to carry for an entire career. New things will excite you. And some of us are able to take the same topic and constantly find novel approaches to it, novel aspects to engage with, and so on. Some of us may not. I mean, the other thing is the fieldwork experience itself. When we read about the fieldwork experience, for most times, it is written in a positive way. It's written as if it was this wondrous story, and for some it may have been. But from my own experience, I'm led to wonder, how much of this good story is the result of editing? Now, I'm not saying every story is a dark story, or that there are, you need to tell the dark story. I think you can make the decision to tell the good story. But I think that, I think for me personally as well, it may be necessary to actually finally tell the story, to finally talk about the things that happened to me in fieldwork, right? And hopefully somebody will find some benefit with that, or in that, and so to speak. The other thing, I spent 4 years working in the Kalahari in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And again, something happened that I don't feel comfortable speaking about. And again, I was disenchanted by the topic. I decided to flee from Khoisan studies and those kinds of things and do other kinds of work. But it wasn't meant to be. Khoisan studies followed me. The plants were there in the Kalahari. They followed me. And then what finally turned me off from the Kalahari and really saddened me was I went there in 2015 to kind of do my first follow-up in 12 years. And the place had radically changed. There had been, what in my view are deteriorations. Older people had died. Some of the younger people I knew were sick, and it was all kinds of social ills. There was a lot of alcoholism, a lot of drug use in the community, and it just wasn't a good place to see. And again, it did something to me, and it made me stop. Now, of course, it's very easy for me to this immediate apparentness of the world that makes me so sad sometimes, or that gets me, disenchants me sometimes. It would be easy for me to write about that, and I'm doing that, and to mediate that with theory about method, and theory about fieldwork and explanations for particular behaviors and so on. So anyway, there's something interesting about the general kind of anthropology of all of this that I think maybe is worth taking a look at as well. So it's, I think what I'm really on about is just, that moment that comes when you see the real messiness of the world, the real as it isness of the world, so to speak. And that can be, or it has been in my case, it's been a real shock to the system sometimes. Just to latch into one of the things Gabriel is saying. So I was making fun with a friend, a Rastafarian friend, a few weeks ago, and he was saying, he has what is the situation thing called? He has to be on blood thinners or something like that, some medication that he takes to thin his blood, and he makes fun of it because everybody he meets, or every Rastafarian he meets, is saying, you must smoke cannabis, you must try the weed, you must try the herb, and he say, well, look, I love it how it's a plant that cures everything for everybody, right? Cannabis is one of those plants that's really easy to study because people say so much about it and people want to talk so much about it. I haven't seen any recent good studies on kind of ethnography and anthropology of marijuana. It would be interesting to see that produced. And again, there's a lot. You can talk to people who grow marijuana, you can talk to this, you can talk to that, you can do kind of legal aspects of it and so on. It will be interesting to see more of those ethnographies. Then also for your student who's going through the TWASA, it's a challenging period. And there have been people in the last 2 decades more and more people who've written about that process. So it would be interesting, again, to have an anthropology student actually document that process, the changes, the growth, and so on. It would be, however, the caution would be, there would have to be some kind of imminent critique of this. It's not a pure matter of reporting. After all, we're dealing with an anthropology here. There has to be some critique from inside, right? That's the one thing that one caution I would put here is, it's not about a kind of nativism that accepts everything. The other thing would be that, I've lost my thought. Yeah, maybe, maybe it'll come back to me in a second. Just to what Professor De Wet is raising as well. Yeah, this is the attractive thing about anthropology, is that it's constantly reinventing itself, it's constantly changing, and so on. And so when I turn to plants, it's not as if a whole 2 or 3 generations of anthropologists have ignored plants. I mean, if you look at Malinowski's work, he spends a lot of time looking at plants. He talks about the gardens, the coral gardens, what is it called? Coral and garden magic. And he's very interested in garden magic. So he's looking at how these people are actually constructing their gardens, they're doing magic in their gardens. And so this really interesting, and one could go to a lot of other ethnography and actually find the plants there. I think what is happening in the now is that, we are re-looking at that world, and we're saying there's some assumptions that have been made all along, particularly assumptions about. Did I now raise my own hand? Particularly assumptions about about the human world and its kind of exclusiveness and so on. And in fact, when we encounter people in other cultural contexts, very often they don't see like as you said, they don't see the same separations of a natural or of a world of plants and a world of people, that these worlds are intertwined. So it is about, actually describing those worlds. One of the things I've been struggling with is that, what does this ethnography really look like? This multi-species ethnography. Yes, it's easy to argue and to do the theory behind it, but how do you actually do the research? And how do you write it up? My sense is that the ethnography has to be a lot more textured and a lot more detailed in certain ways. And it cannot afford to edit out things which had previously been edited out. It has to now speak about human, plant, animal, vegetal, mineral worlds as coexisting, co-mingled, co-produced, co-constructed at the same time, right? And we have to find a way to speak about all those things at once. So, I think that would be a challenge when we do these kinds of multi-species ethnographies and so on. Yeah, I think in things in the chat.
Yeah, there are things in the chat, but I think your last point is interesting because it touches on the very idea you mentioned about becoming with plant or becoming plant, that co-constitutive immanence. So I'll look at Emma's question here, saying, thank you for that very interesting presentation, Prof. You mentioned the Rastafarian practice of bush medicine is of Caribbean origin, whereas in South Africa, the origin is of Khoisan descent. Are there any connections between the two communities and how they practice medicine? Secondly, is the Rastafarian community open to other cultural influences and interpretations based on their beliefs, seeing as it has become part of a wider world culture? And then the second comment is, speaking about plants and their healing properties, you spoke about how witch doctors use different medicines, different plants as medicine. With Gabriel's class, we have been exploring how societies, people, or cultures interact with healing, and with our recent excursions to the field, we are currently working with traditional healers who tell us how they came to know which plants to mix to come up with a healing product. Most of that knowledge is communicated to them by their ancestors through dreams and other means of communication. Would you say it's the same with your study of Rastafarians? Because I picked up that you said they learn from other witch doctors and older kin. I guess my question is, how do they know which plant contains which healing properties, and for which illness, sickness will they heal or work on?
So I didn't say that the medicine is of Caribbean origin. I said the term bush doctor has a Caribbean origin because it is a term that the Rastafarians I engage with derive from reggae music, which has a Caribbean origin, right? So the word bush doctor itself, that's what I was referring to, not necessarily the medicines, but there is a way in which Rastafarians that I've seen in recent years have actually opened up to, or not just in recent years, it's always had that openness towards plants from other contexts. You know, plants like rosemary, lavender, these are not indigenous plants. They are from Europe, right? The use of other plants from elsewhere, moringa for that matter, or something like that, which comes to us from other cultural contexts. Rastafarianism seems open to this. And in fact, if we look at the medicine, the pharmacopoeia of herbalists, Rastafarian herbalists in the Western Cape, they contain some medicines that are close to or from, one could say, Ngoni tradition. For instance, this one plant, it's called Mswati, and they use the shell of the plant, the dried husks of the bulb, to put onto wounds, for instance. And it's known that this plant has also been used in the same way in Ngoni culture, right? So if you want to talk about things like that. And not that I prescribe to those entities 100%, let's just for illustrative purposes. So they are open to taking plants from other cultural contexts, and so on, as long as these are vegetal, right? And as long as these uses don't necessarily, constitute kind of magical or witchcraft or sorcery for that matter, right? I mean, another kind of plant that I see some Rastas using is licorice root, right? This was very common. The local call it suto, sweet wood, and it's literally the licorice root, and they use it for different purposes, right? Also, interestingly, for magical purposes, for that matter. Now, the question of, and this is something which is very well documented, and in fact, if one is pushed to say or to argue, we could argue that dreaming is part of the methodology of traditional healing, and the kind of creation of knowledge. Now, to many people, our initial reaction to say, "Oh, dreaming," but that's that's an illusion. Dream is like you're daydreaming. You're kind of out of touch with reality, out of touch with the moment. But dreaming actually has globally, not just in Xhosa traditional or Zulu traditional culture or Southern African traditional healing systems, dreaming is actually seen as a legit way of gathering knowledge. The quote, and not just that, it's also seen as, not everybody separates those realities with a waking reality and a dreaming reality. Culturally, in many groups, cultures, dreaming is seen as part of the world. It's a real part of the world. It's not a separate, unreality. It's as real as the waking world, right? So not everybody distinguishes it in terms of reality, and not everybody suggests that it's an unreality. One of the quotes I like to give my students when they raise this question is that Albert Einstein suggested that when he really struggled with the problem, he would prepare notes on it or a note on it, put it under his pillow, and he would dream the solution. And apparently, I don't know which problem, and this may just be a kind of, call it like a legend or kind of a hagiographic story. But, so he solved these really complex physics problems by dreaming. And he wouldn't be the first to do that. And dreaming, as I said, is a vital part of many methodologies for gaining knowledge, right? I myself, I love lucid dreaming, so I do meditations for lucid dreaming and so on. And while it may sound outlandish to some people, for me, I see it as a paradigm where, or a place where you're literally just looking at what you've been experiencing through the day and making connections between them. And according to the psychologists and so on, it's quite possible that dreaming helps you to resolve those kinds of contradictions and things that you had been thinking about or experiencing during the day. And it allows you to get over them, to get rid of them, because you've dreamt about them. Now they're done. The problems don't need to trouble you any further. Or you may wake up from a very lucid dream and be able to surmise some kind of resolution to your problem. So yeah, I'm willing to entertain this possibility that one could dream the answer. But in terms of a plant and what a plant contains or what it's good for, I mean, because in some ways you have to kind of be spot on. You can't have a hit and miss. Now, what would it mean to dream about a plant and then dream that it's good for a particular ailment and so on? And is that possible? Well, this is something I also should probably not be doing, is trying to explain it away in scientific, and maybe one should accept it at face value. But even culturally, a plant doesn't exist in a vacuum. That plant exists already within a kind of a web of cultural attributes, if you will. So stories about it, beliefs about it, the question of how it smells, how it tastes, how it looks, where it grows. All those factors could easily combine in some kind of dream state. And in that dream state, you could then put those cultural attributes together in a kind of a logical flow, right? In a kind of a cultural logic, if you will, and make deductions about it. So why not, right? And so on and so on. One could continue to argue different ways of supporting that notion of dreaming. Yeah, dreaming is also an interesting concept. I have a student who's actually doing a master's degree on psychoactive substances being used by traditional healers. And one of the things, one of the problems has been to find a word in Xhosa that signifies hallucination. And it's been real, and the closest they've come is a kind of a descriptive term. It works in the head, right? But it doesn't really touch on what hallucination is. But part of that kind of defining or translating this word hallucination may also be, or what people in traditional Xhosa culture maybe, or what the traditional healers rather are calling dreaming, may in part also describe what we call a hallucination, right? A particular state that is produced where certain things become apparent and so on. Yeah, and one could go on. I mean, there's a lot of work we can do in the kind of translation of cultural attributes and things like dreaming and so on. So, and there are over 300 plants in South Africa that produce psychoactive states. And a lot of these plants are described by traditional healers as by the term bulau, which is just something that produces dreams. So traditional healers actively want to produce dreams. Dream is not some kind of, what's the word? Not occasional. Something which is just by the way. It's not a by the way state. It's something that's actively sought out. It's not some accidental process. For us, we go to sleep and we're not really concerned what we're going to dream about, and dreams happen, and if it doesn't, blah, 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 and so on. But with traditional healing, dreams are actively sought, and substances that produce dreams are highly valued in the practice, right? Because dream states are seen as those states in which resolutions take place, and so on. So, and one could go on and talk about dreaming and in the production of knowledge, especially in traditional systems, on and on and on. But I think I'm going to leave it there. Is there something else that somebody was going to say?
No, it doesn't look like there's anything else. So maybe I might ask for you to just wrap it up for us, just one final takeaway point for all of us. But I just to also respond to what you've shared over the last few minutes, I think overall, perhaps then what this work sounds like it's doing, it's critiquing this binary or the separation of nature and culture, the separation of human and non-human, and you are considering how through the narratives and experiences of these Rastafarians that you worked with and collaborated with, they are demonstrating how plants are so intricately, a part of their existence, and maybe that's the for me at least that's the interesting aspect of your paper today, and this intimacy, this Rastafarian plant intimacy you have spoken to, and just as you're speaking about dreams as well, responding to the last point, another thing for me that I think emerges is the agency of things, and how these plants are not just objects that are being used for healing, but the plants themselves seem to have a force and agency that is making people dream, that is making people move. And you also touched on the idea of the romanticism with nature, and I think all of these points are quite interesting because it seems like the plants themselves are actively also orchestrating or creating these environments for humans to retreat back into. I'll end there.
Okay, I wanted to greet Lorato, but I see she's left the room. If you guys see her, just tell I said hello, and I'm glad she came. Yeah. So how do we end this off, right? What am I thinking I'm going to eventually argue with this work? And again, this is not something that I've developed myself. This comes from the literature and so on. So the idea is that, if we take a Rastafarian, they're looking at the world, they're seeing things, right? Doing different things, the agency of things. And they see plants and they find there's an affinity. They find that plants are doing something that seems right. There's something about the nature of plants that just feels right. And in that, what if because after all, and the philosophers are arguing that, there's something in terms of our natures. We have a plant nature, an animal nature, and then we have above that, maybe, or not above, but coexistent with that, a human nature. And we shouldn't forget how we are also at the same time living things and like plants as well. And if we see this thing in the plant nature and we aspire to it, we think about it, we want to be like it, I think that's what Rastafarians are doing. They're purposely associating with the plants because the plants show them something that they feel that they intuitively feel is right. It's about a way of being in the world, and plants have that way of being that they are aspiring to. Mm-hmm. In another way, there's also a sense in which Rastafarians are contrasting themselves with the Babylon. They're saying the Babylon is out there, the Babylon's doing all these things. They have this way of being that we don't want to be part of. We want to be like the plants. So in some sense, they're conspiring with the plants. They're forming alliances with the plants. And it's interesting to note that the word conspire, and as I also use the word aspire, but the word conspire means to breathe together. So when you're involved in a conspiracy, you're involved in an attempt for two beings to breathe together. And can we say that the Rastafarian culture, the phytoculture that we call the Rastafarian, is in a conspiracy with the plants in an attempt to continue, because we all breathe with the plants, they give us oxygen, but to continue to breathe with the plants in some kind of alliance and common way of being. I think I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating paper and fascinating seminar. Yeah, thank you. So I'd also like to thank everyone for attending, you know, and engaging with today's paper. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I think I'll also end there.
Thanks, people. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the opportunity, Malusi.
Thank you. Thank you.